In the shadows of Brazil's coffee plantations, where soil was fed with blood and tears, lived a man whose very existence became a testament to the most intimate violations of slavery. They called him Patika, Dryfoot, a name that only hints at the weight of his story. He stood over 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry burdens no human should ever be forced to bear. But he was transformed from a person into something else entirely, an instrument of reproduction, a man compelled to father hundreds of children destined to be born in bondage. His story confronts us with a truth too often erased from sanitized history books, that slavery's cruelty reached far beyond whips and chains. It invaded even the sacred act of human creation. The story of Roque José Florencio did not begin in the green hills of Sao Paulo, but thousands of miles away in Angola, where a boy's life was shattered forever. Around 1828, in a village whose name has been lost to history, a child was born free. He would have grown up learning the traditions of his people, speaking the languages of his ancestors, singing the songs of his homeland. But the Atlantic slave trade stretched its tentacles deep into Africa, and this boy, perhaps only 6 or 7 years old, was caught in its grip. He was swept away into a current of suffering that would drag him across an ocean. The slavers who seized him could not have known they were taking a child who would grow into a giant, a man of such stature and strength that his life would become legend in the tragic mythology of Brazilian slavery. The Middle Passage carried young Roe into hell itself. Packed inside the suffocating hold of a slave ship, children were forced to see horrors no one should ever witness. The stench of death, the reek of human waste, the constant rocking that made them endlessly sick, the iron chains cutting into their growing limbs. This was the boy's initiation into his new reality. Many never survived the crossing. Those who did came out changed forever. For weeks, even months, depending on wind and weather, young Roe drifted between life and death, between childhood and a forced, premature adulthood. When the ship finally reached Brazil, most likely docking in Rio de Janeiro or Salvador, the boy who stepped onto the pier was no longer the child who had once run free in Angola. Brazil in the mid-19th century was booming, its wealth built entirely on enslaved Africans. Coffee had become green gold, and the fertile soil of Sao Paulo's interior was perfectly suited for it. The demand for labor was endless. But by the 1850s, international pressure forced Brazil to end the Atlantic slave trade. Plantation owners faced a crisis: how to maintain their workforce without fresh captives from Africa. The answer they devised was as horrific as it was practical: breed human beings like livestock, building a self-sustaining population of slaves. One such place was the Fazenda Santa Eudoxia, in what is now São Carlos, São Paulo. It was here that Rose spent most of his life, and here that he was given the name that would follow him through history, Patika. The origin of that name carries its own small mysteries. Some said it came from his ability to cross streams without wetting his feet, his long legs keeping him high above the water. Others believed it described a physical condition, perhaps a lack of sweat glands in his feet. Whatever the truth, names given to enslaved people were rarely innocent. They were marks of ownership, imposed identities, just as scarring or branding marked bodies. As Patika grew from boy to man, his extraordinary size and strength could not be ignored. Oral histories tell of him standing over 7 feet tall, with power that seemed almost supernatural. In the fields, he could do the labor of 3 men. He carried weights that would break others' backs. He endured endless hours under the sun, from dawn to dusk, without collapsing as so many others did. But it was precisely these qualities that sealed his fate. Where others saw a man, his master saw breeding stock. Brazil's system of forced reproduction ran with the cold precision of any other agricultural program. Plantation owners kept meticulous records of their human property. Many of those documents have been destroyed or lost, but we know what they contained: lists of physical traits, work ability, temperament, and, chillingly, reproductive potential. Women were valued for fertility, forced to bear child after child with no time to heal, no choice, no voice. Men like Patika were chosen for their size, strength, stamina, and lack of visible defects. The children produced by these forced unions were investments. They would grow into future laborers, costing nothing but minimal food and shelter in childhood. We don't know exactly when Patika was first forced into this role, but we can imagine what it meant. One day he was a field hand. The next, he was brought to another part of the plantation. Perhaps his master explained directly, or perhaps Patika understood without words. Either way, the message was clear: this was his new function. The women brought to him had no choice. Consent was impossible in a world where they were considered property. Oral traditions suggest that Patika's forced role went beyond his own plantation. Some say he was made to father children with enslaved women from multiple estates. His story, passed down in whispers, shows us that slavery's violence did not stop at the lash. It invaded the most private corners of human existence, turning love, intimacy, and family into tools of oppression. Masters either lent him out or brought women to Santa Eudoxia specifically for this purpose. The logistics of this horrific enterprise reveal just how calculated slavery's reproductive exploitation was. The mathematics of Patika's tragedy are staggering, and still disputed. Conservative estimates suggest he fathered at least 200 children. Oral traditions push the number even higher, some claiming 250 or even 300. If we accept the lower figure, and assume his forced breeding began around the age of 18 and continued until abolition, when he was about 60, the numbers are devastating. That would mean he was made to father a child every 2 to 3 months for more than 4 decades. The women who bore these children, their names largely unrecorded, their stories untold, endured profound trauma of their own. They were forced into pregnancy after pregnancy, their bodies treated as vessels for producing human property. Their bonds with their children were constantly broken, as those children were sold away or separated. The suffering multiplied across hundreds of lives, all stemming from one man's designation as breeding stock. The children of Patika entered the world already marked by their parentage. On plantations, they were identified, catalogued, their paternity noted in ledgers that tracked human beings the way livestock were inventoried. Some accounts suggest Patika's children were especially valued on the slave market. His towering size and great strength were considered heritable traits that commanded higher prices. Brothers and sisters, half-siblings scattered across different estates, might grow up never even knowing they were related. This breaking of family bonds was no accident. It was central to slavery's design. Kinship created solidarity, and solidarity threatened the total control slavery depended on. The daily reality of Patika's life is almost beyond comprehension. By day, he labored under the blazing sun in the coffee fields, his immense strength exploited to the fullest. By night, he was forced into a different kind of labor, one that violated the most intimate boundaries of human autonomy. He could never form lasting romantic bonds, never choose when or whether to be a father, never exercise authority over his own body. The psychological toll of such an existence can only be imagined: the guilt, the shame, the powerlessness, the rage that must have built up over decades. Some accounts describe him as a quiet, withdrawn man, speaking little. And how could it be otherwise? What words could ever capture the weight of such systematic violation? The women forced to bear his children faced their own impossible circumstances. Oral traditions suggest that a few may have developed something like affection for him. But we must be careful with such stories. Under slavery, survival often depended on displaying emotions that masters wanted to see. A woman who resisted might be beaten brutally, or torn away from the children she had already given birth to. The truth is more complicated. These forced relationships existed in a space neither fully consensual nor entirely devoid of human feeling. They reveal how slavery twisted every aspect of human connection. The women, whose names are mostly lost to history, were participants in a tragedy they did not choose, their agency crushed at every turn. The broader context of forced breeding in Brazil mirrored global patterns of reproductive exploitation under slavery. In the United States, after the 1808 ban on importing enslaved people, breeding became an industry in places like Virginia and Maryland. The Caribbean had its own brutal systems. But Brazil's case was distinct. As the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery, Brazil had more time to refine and intensify these practices. The scale was enormous. Brazil imported more enslaved Africans than any other country in the Americas. And when imports ended, the pressure to maintain the population through forced reproduction grew even more intense. The Catholic Church's role in this system is riddled with contradictions. Brazil was officially Catholic, and the Church's teachings emphasized the sanctity of marriage and family. Yet in practice, the Church mostly stood by while slavery shattered families. Some priests performed marriage ceremonies for enslaved couples, but these unions had no legal standing. A master could dissolve them at will, with a sale or a forced separation. Children born from Patika's forced unions were often baptized, their names recorded in parish books. Those records remain some of the only traces of their existence. But baptism did not make them free. It simply gave religious sanction to their enslavement. The economic logic behind forced breeding was brutally clear. A healthy enslaved woman could bear a child roughly every 2 years from puberty to menopause. If she had 10 children who survived to working age, and each child could be valued at 500 milreis, the currency of the time, that meant 5,000 milreis in added wealth. A fortune by the standards of the era. A man like Patika, capable of fathering hundreds of children, represented an almost unimaginable multiplication of profit. His master at Santa Eudoxia likely saw him as the single most valuable piece of property on the plantation. Not because of his work in the fields, but because of his ability to produce more property. The health costs of this system were devastating, and ignored. Women endured constant pregnancies without prenatal care, without recovery time, and with inadequate nutrition. Maternal mortality was high. Many children born into these conditions died young, victims of disease and malnutrition. Men like Patika carried their own burdens, exhausting physical labor by day, forced reproduction by night. Though his extraordinary constitution allowed him to survive what killed many others, the system considered such suffering the cost of doing business in human flesh. By the 1870s, change was stirring in Brazil. In 1871, the Free Womb Law declared that children born to enslaved women would be free. But the law came with conditions. Many of those children remained bound to their mother's master until adulthood. This law cracked the logic of forced breeding. What use was reproduction if the children were not guaranteed property? And yet, the practice continued in many places. Some masters ignored the law outright. Others found ways around it. For Patika, then in his 40s, this must have been a time of deep uncertainty. Were the children he was still being forced to father truly free, or still enslaved? The answer often depended less on the law, and more on the whims of their masters. The abolitionist movement in Brazil gathered strength throughout the 1880s. Figures like Joaquim Nabuco and André Rebucas pushed for complete emancipation, while enslaved people themselves resisted in every way they could, through escapes, rebellions, and daily acts of defiance that steadily weakened the system. Patika lived through this storm of change, perhaps daring to imagine a freedom that had seemed impossibly far away for most of his life. The quilombos, communities of escaped slaves, were multiplying across the interior of São Paulo. Did Patika ever consider running away to one of them? His towering height would have made him instantly recognizable, and the punishment for capture was brutal. Yet the fact that he survived long enough to see abolition suggests that he found ways to endure, to preserve some fragile core of self, despite decades of being systematically dehumanized. On May 13, 1888, Princess Isabel signed the Golden Law, abolishing slavery in Brazil. Patika was about 60 years old then. His exact age is impossible to know, records were deliberately destroyed, but in that moment, after a lifetime of bondage, he was suddenly free. Yet what did freedom mean for a man who had been reduced to breeding stock? His hundreds of children, scattered across plantations, were free as well. But how many of them had he ever met? How many even knew he was their father? Liberation, which should have been unclouded joy, was instead complicated by fractures, losses, and unanswered questions that could never be healed. In the immediate aftermath of abolition, many freed people left the plantations where they had been held, seeking lost family members or simply putting distance between themselves and the landscapes of their trauma. Patika, however, according to oral histories, stayed in the region of Santa Eudoxia. His former master, in what was presented as generosity, but was more likely an effort to keep labor tied to the land, granted him a piece of property. Was this land a form of compensation for decades of stolen labor and violated humanity? Or was it just another kind of control? The answer probably held pieces of both. It was in this fragile new freedom that Patika reportedly married a woman named Palmyra. After decades of forced, empty unions, he could finally choose a partner and build a family rooted in affection instead of compulsion. Together, they had 9 children, a number that feels almost modest compared to the hundreds he had been forced to father before. But these 9 were different. These were children he could raise, claim, and love as a free man. The contrast must have been overwhelming, joy mixed with grief. Each tender moment with these 9 children must have carried the shadow of the countless others he could never truly father. Yet his marriage to Palmyra shines as one of the rare points of light in his story. We know almost nothing about her. Was she once enslaved as well? How did they meet? What drew them together? What we can guess is that her strength and compassion must have been extraordinary. By choosing to marry him, to build a family with a man so scarred by trauma, she helped him create something that slavery had always denied: a home, a chosen family, a space for love and autonomy. Their relationship stands as proof of the human capacity to forge meaning and tenderness, even after the deepest wounds. Still, life in post-abolition Brazil was far from easy. Freed slaves received nothing in return for generations of stolen labor: no land, no reparations, not even the 40 acres and a mule that had briefly been promised in the United States. They were left to survive in a society still dominated by the same plantation owners, still poisoned by racism. Patika, even with his supposed land grant, would have struggled with the same questions as millions of others. How do you earn a living when the economy is still ruled by your former masters? How do you find dignity in a society that still sees you as less than human? The community that grew in Santa Eudoxia after abolition was shaped profoundly by Patika's legacy. Genetic studies and oral traditions suggest that a significant portion of the Afro-Brazilian population in the area descends from him. Family reunions in the region sometimes gather hundreds of people who all trace their lineage back to this one man. But such a legacy carries deep complexity. Some descendants embrace their connection with pride, seeing him as a survivor whose endurance made their lives possible. Others struggle with the pain of knowing their family tree is rooted in systematic sexual violence and reproductive exploitation. A statue of Patika stands today in Santa Eudoxia, whether bronze or stone depends on the account. It shows him tall and strong, a dignified figure despite all he endured. Yet the monument is complicated. Can a statue ever truly honor someone whose life was defined by violations so profound they defy representation? For some, it is necessary recognition for a man denied humanity for so long. For others, it risks romanticizing or simplifying a history that requires harder truths and deeper reckoning. The destruction of slavery-era documents by Brazilian authorities in the 1890s, justified at the time as a way to prevent freed people from being taxed for their past servitude, created enormous gaps in the historical record. Into those gaps, oral tradition poured. Stories about Patika shifted and grew with each retelling. Some say he lived to 130, dying in 1958, a claim that strains belief, but reflects the legendary place he holds in local memory. Whether he lived to 90 or to 130, whether he fathered 200 children or 300, the unshakable truth remains: he was a man forced into reproductive exploitation on a massive scale. The most haunting questions are those that cannot be answered. Did Patika feel any connection to the hundreds of children he was forced to father? Did he carry guilt for his involuntary role in sustaining the system that enslaved them? How did he process the transformation from breeding stock to free man, husband, and chosen father? We will never know. No diaries, no letters, no words survive from him. His inner life is accessible only through imagination and empathy, a fragile attempt to grasp experiences that may be forever beyond the understanding of those who never lived them. The women who bore his children are even more obscured in history. Some of their names survive in baptismal records, some in fragments of oral tradition, but little else. Each woman carried her own trauma, her own story of survival or loss. They were not simply vessels for Patika's forced fatherhood. They were individuals, with their own struggles, resilience, and humanity. The women who bore Pata Sika's children had their own complex responses to systematic violence. Some may have protected and loved the children they bore. Others may have struggled to bond with babies who represented their own violation. The absence of their voices in the historical record reflects the multiple marginalizations that enslaved women faced. The economic impact of Pata Sika's forced reproduction extended far beyond his lifetime. If we accept that he fathered 200 children, and each of those children represented potential labor value to their enslavers, the total economic extraction from this one man's reproductive capacity would have been enormous. His descendants, working without wages for decades, generated wealth that flowed upward to plantation owners, coffee merchants, and ultimately to the global markets that consumed Brazilian coffee. The coffee in European and North American cups was sweetened not just with sugar produced by slave labor, but with the stolen futures of families like Pata Sika's. Modern Brazil continues to grapple with the legacies of slavery, and stories like Pata Sika's complicate simple narratives of racial harmony or democratic progress. The country has the largest population of African descendants outside of Africa. Yet racial inequality remains profound. The descendants of enslaved people like Pata Sika often live in favelas and peripheries, excluded from the wealth their ancestors' labor created. The reproductive exploitation that Pata Sika experienced has echoes in contemporary reproductive injustices, from forced sterilizations to inadequate maternal health care for black women. The international dimensions of Pata Sika's story connect Brazil to broader patterns of racial exploitation. The coffee his labor helped produce was consumed in the United States and Europe, linking his suffering to global commodity chains. The racial ideologies that justified his treatment were not unique to Brazil, but part of a worldwide system of white supremacy that classified African-descended people as less than human. His story cannot be understood in isolation, but must be seen as part of the global history of racial capitalism and reproductive violence. Contemporary discussions of reparations in Brazil often invoke stories like Pata Sika's. If the Brazilian state and society benefited from the forced reproduction of enslaved people, what obligations exist to their descendants? The multiplication of exploitation, labor stolen, families destroyed, and generations born into bondage creates a debt that compounds over time. Yet Brazil, like most countries built on slavery, has been reluctant to engage in serious reparative justice. The statue of Pata Sika stands, but the structural inequalities his exploitation helped create remain largely unaddressed. The memorialization of Pata Sika raises questions about how societies remember traumatic histories. Should his story be told to children in schools? If so, how can educators convey the full horror of reproductive exploitation while remaining age-appropriate? How can his descendants honor their ancestor while acknowledging the violence that created their lineage? These are not abstract questions in Santa Uxodia, where Pata Sika's legacy is lived daily by those who carry his genetic inheritance and the social consequences of slavery's aftermath. The search for Pata Sika's African origins represents another dimension of his story's contemporary relevance. Genetic testing could potentially identify ethnic groups or regions in Angola from which he came, connecting Brazilian descendants to African relatives. But such connections are fraught with complexity. How can relationships be built across the Atlantic divide that slavery created? What would it mean for Pata Sika's Brazilian descendants to find African cousins whose ancestors avoided capture? These possibilities of connection and reconciliation exist alongside the irreparable rupture that the slave trade represents. The role of gender in Pata Sika's story deserves particular attention. His forced reproduction was enabled by patriarchal systems that viewed both enslaved women and enslaved men as objects to be manipulated for economic gain. But the specific violations differed by gender. Women bore the physical burden of pregnancy and childbirth. men like Pata Sika were denied the ability to protect or provide for their offspring. Both experiences represent profound violations of human dignity, but they operated through different mechanisms of control. Understanding these gender dimensions helps us see how slavery weaponized reproductive capacity in multiple ways. The psychological concept of trauma transmission suggests that the violence experienced did not end with him, or even with his immediate children. Studies of intergenerational trauma show that extreme experiences can affect genetic expression, passing down impacts through biological as well as social mechanisms. The descendants of Pata Sika may carry in their very selves the biological imprint of his suffering. This adds another layer to discussions of reparations and healing. How can societies address traumas that are literally embodied in the descendants of those who suffered? As Brazil confronts its racial inequalities in the 21st century, stories like Pata Sika's become increasingly important. They challenge narratives of racial democracy that have long obscured the depth of slavery's violence. They demand recognition that slavery was not just about labor exploitation but about the comprehensive violation of human beings in every aspect of their existence. And they insist that the past is not past, that forced paternity created lineages that continue to navigate the aftermath of slavery's destructions. The environmental context of Pata Sika's story also deserves consideration. The coffee plantations where he labored and was forced to reproduce were carved from Brazil's Atlantic forest, one of the world's most biodiverse ecosystems. The same system that violated human beings also ravaged the natural world. Today, less than 15% of the original Atlantic forest remains. The environmental and human costs of the plantation economy are intertwined, both representing forms of extraction that treated life, human and non-human, as resources to be exploited unto exhaustion. The cultural productions inspired by Pata Sika's story, songs, poems, novels, films, attempt to give artistic form to experiences that resist representation. How can art capture the scale of his violation without exploiting it further? How can culture honor his memory without sanitizing his suffering? Brazilian artists have grappled with these questions, creating works that try to restore humanity to a figure who was systematically dehumanized. These cultural works become part of the ongoing process of reckoning with slavery's legacies. The comparison between Pata Sika and similar figures in other slave societies reveals both unique and universal elements of reproductive exploitation under slavery. In the United States, men like Nat Turner were also forced to father children for their master's profit. In the Caribbean, similar practices existed on sugar plantations. But the scale attributed to Pata Sika, 200 or more children, appears to be exceptional. Whether this reflects the actual uniqueness of his case or the mythological accumulation of stories around his figure remains uncertain. The legal implications of Pata Sika's story continue to resonate. Brazilian law now recognizes various forms of contemporary slavery, from forced labor to human trafficking. But the specific crime of forced reproduction has received less attention. International human rights. International human rights law classifies forced pregnancy as a crime against humanity. But historical cases like Pata Sika's exist in a legal gray zone. Should there be posthumous recognition of the crimes committed against him? Can legal frameworks adequately address violations that were legal under the systems that perpetrated them? The religious dimensions of Pata Sika's experience reflect the complex role of faith under slavery. Many enslaved people found in Christianity or syncretic Afro-Brazilian religions sources of strength and resistance. But religion was also used to justify slavery and encourage submission. Did Pata Sika maintain faith through his ordeal? Did he practice African religious traditions in secret, or adopt the Catholicism of his enslavers? The destruction of records makes these questions unanswerable, but they point to the spiritual dimensions of survival under extreme oppression. The stories told about Pata Sika in contemporary Santa Eudoxia vary depending on who tells them and to whom. Older residents who claim direct descent may emphasize his strength and survival. Younger people might focus on the injustice he suffered. White Brazilians in the region may minimize or avoid the story altogether. These varied tellings reflect ongoing struggles over memory, identity, and responsibility. Pata Sika becomes not just a historical figure, but a screen onto which contemporary racial anxieties and aspirations are projected. The tourism potential of Pata Sika's story presents ethical dilemmas. Should sites associated with his life be developed as historical attractions? Can slavery tourism be educational without being exploitative? Some argue that bringing visitors to Santa Eudoxia to learn about him could provide economic benefits to his descendants while spreading awareness of slavery's realities. Others worry about the commodification of suffering, turning trauma into entertainment. These debates reflect broader tensions about how slavery's history should be presented and who should benefit from its telling. The scientific interest in Pata Sika's genetic legacy raises additional ethical questions. Should researchers study the DNA of his descendants to understand population genetics and ancestry? Who owns the genetic information derived from such studies? How should benefits from such research be distributed? These questions become particularly pointed given that Pata Sika's reproduction was coerced. His genetic legacy is simultaneously a resource for understanding human history and a reminder of violent exploitation. As we near the conclusion of Pata Sika's story, we must resist the temptation to find redemption where none exists. Yes, he survived to see freedom. Yes, he created a chosen family with Palmyra. Yes, his descendants have survived and sometimes thrived. But these facts do not mitigate the horror of what was done to him. They do not transform a tragedy into a triumph. They simply remind us that human beings can endure almost unimaginable suffering and still maintain some capacity for love and connection. This is not inspirational. It is heartbreaking. The legacy of Pata Sika extends beyond his biological descendants to encompass all who grapple with slavery's aftermath. His story challenges us to confront the most intimate violations of human dignity, to recognize that slavery's violence extended into the very creation of life. It demands that we see enslaved people not as historical abstractions, but as individuals who experienced specific embodied violations. And it insists that we recognize the ongoing impacts of these violations in contemporary racial inequalities and injustices. The question of what Pata Sika would want us to do with his story cannot be answered. He left no testimony about his wishes for how he should be remembered. Would he want his story told at all? Or would he prefer the privacy denied him in life? Would he want his descendants to know of their connection to him, or would he wish to spare them that burden? We cannot know. But we can choose to tell his story in ways that honor his humanity while refusing to sanitize his suffering, that recognize his survival while acknowledging what was survived. The international resonance of Pata Sika's story in an era of global racial reckoning suggests its ongoing relevance. As countries around the world confront their histories of racial violence and exploitation, cases like his provide specific, undeniable evidence of slavery's comprehensive violations. His story cannot be dismissed as exaggeration or ancient history. When his descendants walk the streets of Sao Paulo today, the forced multiplication of his paternity created a living archive of slavery's violence, bodies that testify to historical trauma. The linguistic challenge of telling Pata Sika's story reflects broader difficulties in discussing slavery. What language can adequately convey the scale and intimacy of his violation? Terms like breeding reduce humans to animals, yet euphemisms obscure the violence of what occurred. Even the phrase, forced to father, inadequately captures the systematic rape and reproductive exploitation involved. The failure of language mirrors the failure of moral imagination that made such violence possible. We tell his story with words that cannot fully bear the weight of what they must describe. As modern DNA technology makes it increasingly possible to trace genealogies and identify relationships, more of Pata Sika's descendants may discover their connection to him. What responsibilities come with such knowledge? Should descendants seek each other out, forming a community based on shared ancestry, or does the violence at the root of their connection make such community building problematic? These are not theoretical questions for the thousands of Brazilians who carry Pata Sika's genetic inheritance. They must navigate the personal and political implications of descending from both a survivor and a victim of one of history's greatest crimes. The economic quantification of Pata Sika's exploitation, the attempt to calculate the value extracted from his forced reproduction, risks reducing his humanity to numbers once again. Yet such calculations may be necessary for reparations arguments. If we can demonstrate the specific economic benefits that flowed from his violation, perhaps we can make claims for specific redress. But every such calculation must be accompanied by recognition that no amount of money could truly compensate for what was taken from him, not just labor and autonomy, but the fundamental right to choose whom to love and whether to create life. The ecological metaphor of invasive species provides another lens for understanding Pata Sika's story. Just as plantations replaced diverse forests with monoculture crops, slavery attempted to control human reproduction for maximum economic yield. But life resists such control. Pata Sika's descendants have spread far beyond Santa Eudoxia, carrying their heritage to Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and beyond. They have become teachers, artists, workers, activists, everything their ancestor was prevented from being. In their diversity and agency, they represent the failure of slavery's attempt to reduce human beings to a single function. The contemporary Afro-Brazilian movement's engagement with figures like Pata Sika reflects evolving strategies of resistance and remembrance. Some activists argue that focusing on extreme cases like his risks exceptionalizing slavery's violence, making it seem aberrant rather than systematic. Others contend that precisely such extreme cases reveal the system's true nature. This debate over how to mobilize historical memory for contemporary justice continues, with Pata Sika's story serving as a touchstone for different approaches to racial politics in Brazil. The transnational dimensions of reproductive exploitation under slavery connect Pata Sika's story to contemporary human trafficking and forced reproduction. Around the world today, people are still subjected to forced pregnancy and coerced reproduction. The Islamic State's systematic rape of Yazidi women, the forced pregnancies in Bosnia, the ongoing trafficking of women for sexual exploitation, these all echoed the violations Pata Sika endured. His historical case becomes a lens for understanding today's atrocities and for insisting that reproductive autonomy is, and must always be, a fundamental human right. The absence of archival material around Pata Sika, the lack of his own words, the destruction of records, the heavy reliance on oral tradition, mirrors the wider erasure of enslaved people's voices from history. What we know of him comes primarily through the eyes of others, descendants who claim him, historians who piece his story together, artists who reimagine his life. But the man himself remains elusive, a presence constructed from fragments and projections. This kind of archival violence compounds the physical violence he endured, denying him even the posthumous dignity of speaking for himself. As we reach the conclusion of Pata Sika's life and legacy, we are left to sit with the discomfort his story creates. There is no happy ending here, no redemptive arc that transforms his suffering into something meaningful. His story is not ultimately about resilience, or even survival, though he did survive. It is about violation, systematic, calculated, intimate violation that reduced a human being to a tool of production. The hundreds of children he was forced to father were not blessings, but living evidence of crimes. The fact that many of his descendants later built meaningful lives does not, and cannot, retroactively justify the traumatic origins of their existence. The statue of Pata Sika in Santa Eudoxia will continue to weather with time, like all monuments do. Eventually it will require restoration or replacement. When that moment arrives, the community will face difficult decisions. Should the statue be updated to reflect new historical understandings? Should it stand alongside monuments to the women who bore his children? Or should it be removed entirely, the pain it represents simply too heavy to preserve in bronze or stone? Whatever choice is made, it will reflect evolving relationships with the past and the ongoing struggle over memory and justice. Children learning about Patas in Brazilian schools today face the challenge of grappling with a history their textbooks often sanitize. Teachers must find ways to tell the truth about reproductive exploitation, ways that honor the victims without traumatizing young minds, ways that connect past violations to contemporary inequalities. Teaching slavery is never simple, and cases like Patas make it even more complex. How do you explain to children that their ancestors, perhaps even their direct ancestors, endured violations that must never be repeated? The global circulation of Pata Sika's story through academic articles, documentaries, And now this script raises pressing questions about ownership and interpretation. Who has the right to tell his story? How should non-Brazilians, non-descendants, or non-black people engage with this narrative? Internationalizing his story carries both risks and possibilities. It may lead to appropriation, flattening him into a mere symbol of universal suffering and erasing the specifically Brazilian and African contexts of his life. Or it may foster solidarity, building connections between struggles for racial justice across borders.